Briefly, and then I'll give the floor to Marcus and Joel, or Joel and Marcus. I'm going to speak briefly about the importance of creating critical contemporary anti-Semitism studies. Before I do, I'm going to speak about ISGAP and describe what we're doing very briefly, just to give you a sense of what we do. So in 2003, I started ISGAP. Professor Elie Wiesel was our first president. I started it with him. He organized a conference at the United Nations with Kofi Annan when he was the Secretary General. And it was the first program at the United Nations on issues of anti-Semitism. And that was in 2003. So it took the United Nations. The United Nations was literally born out of the ashes of the Holocaust. And it took until 2003 for the first program on anti-Semitism. And that was thanks to Kofi Annan and his work with Elie Wiesel. And at this conference, there's a small group of scholars that were concerned about the rise of anti-Semitism. So we started a study group, and it evolved into ISGAP. So ISGAP was created as a non-profit organization in the United States. And then we created an entity in Canada, the UK, the European Union, and in Israel. Natan Sharansky, who was a very important human rights activist in the Soviet Union, is currently our chair. You'll meet Seema Vaknin-Gill. She's a Vice President of Strategic Development. She'll be coming here to speak next week. She has an illustrious career in government and also in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. She was a Brigadier General in the Israeli Army. She's a strategic genius, and she'll be speaking about strategy and issues of anti-Semitism. We have groups of research fellows. We offer online courses. We offer seminar series. Our research fellows have kind of created small study groups in different aspects of the study of contemporary anti-Semitism. We have the summer program, which you know about, and we also have a small research center that's developing at Cambridge University. We had a postdoc fellowship program that Lev was one of two fellows. They took two fellows because they were nervous about the study of anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitism is perceived increasingly in academia as something as racist, as supporting apartheid, as right-wing, and as not scholarship, but advocacy. So they took a chance with ISGAP, and Lev and Chloe Pinto and myself, I guess, through our work, has convinced them that we are not all white supremacist, fascist, apartheid supporters. So we get to, next year we'll have 4 research fellows there, and we're going to be integrated into the college and university system. For the first 2 years, we were just at a research center, at an institute, so it was sort of a trial period. But this is how the study of anti-Semitism is often portrayed and perceived by academics. So that's basically what we do at ISGAP, and we're trying to expand into the United States. The reason why we chose working in Oxford in the United Kingdom is that, I'd say 10 years ago, 15 years ago, Europe was really the center of anti-Semitism, or the re-emergence of anti-Semitism, particularly in France and the UK. And I understood, for reasons which I'll explain briefly tonight and tomorrow in my lecture, that anti-Semitism was going to be, it was becoming exacerbated by the global situation, and that it was going to increase. And the wave of anti-Semitism from Western Europe has sort of come into Canada and the United States now, and we knew it was coming, and I'll explain why. So we were trying to bring scholars from around the world to the UK to look at what was happening here on the ground. Here's Dr. Barsky, thank you, nice to see you. Yudi Barsky will be speaking on the program. She just arrived from the States, so welcome. We're just starting. You just missed the introductions. So Yehudit is she's an expert on Islamist anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism in the United States. And she's a colleague and a fellow at ISGAP, and we're working on projects together. So, an amazing voice on these issues. So. I'm happy you're here, and you'll meet everybody shortly. So have a coffee and a seat. Feel free. So we were trying to bring scholars to Oxford, and we brought all these experts, Joel was here and some other scholars, teaching professors about the rise of contemporary anti-Semitism. And many of the professors during the first week perceived this issue as being kind of Zionist advocacy, that there really wasn't anti-Semitism, it disappeared after the Holocaust magically, but that we were defending the apartheid racist problematic entity, and we were advocates and not scholars. And we had this in the classroom. And we have this for the first week. The second week would bring them to the Community Security Trust, which you'll visit on Monday. The Community Security Trust is probably the preeminent organization that defends or secures the Jewish community of the United Kingdom. They are responsible for safeguarding every physically safeguarding every Jewish high school, synagogue, and neighborhood. And they're plugged into the local police and also the national police, the MI5, Scotland Yard, and other organizations. And you'll see they have a situation room where the entire community or communities in the United Kingdom is wired into this Community Security Trust headquarters. And it's only then when these progressive, postmodern scholars would actually see how the Jewish community of a great democracy, a great city like London, right? A very important international democratic society, that the Community Security Trust has to physically defend the Jewish community from white nationalists and skinheads, by Islamists, by radical anarchists. And it was only then that, we would show these professors like what is really happening on the ground to a Jewish community in a Western liberal democracy. And it's only then that the light bulb started to go off, and they began to realize that anti-Semitism didn't go away with the end of the Holocaust, but it's still deeply rooted in our societies. And this is what we try to unpack. I'll explain tomorrow how I came to this issue. So I was, you'll see in my biography, I was a scholar, but also a human rights advocate fighting against apartheid when it still existed on campus. I'll never forget going to McGill University, where I took a course with Professor Sam Newmoff, a professor from New York City, Jewish guy who was a Leninist. And he used to wear safari suits, and he used to have a cigarette holder, and he used to give us classes called Comparative Revolution. He was a character, but a great teacher. And he gave a lecture on apartheid in South Africa, and I was like 19 years old. And I went up to him afterwards, after the class, and I said, when did apartheid end? And he laughed at me. And he said, it didn't end. So I said naively, I said, well, when will it end? And he said, I don't know. I said, the regime is still deeply entrenched in South Africa. So, to realize that a regime that is deeply connected philosophically, scientifically, theologically to Nazism was still alive and well in my lifetime was a shock, right? So this ideology of defining groups of people in a particular way for the benefit of other groups of people is still alive and well. So I was a sort of progressive human rights guy, got involved in the anti-apartheid movement, and through that, as I told you, I met my mentor. I go off to Oxford and study here. And I was looking at issues of cultural identity and globalization, the impact of neoliberal globalization on culture and on societies. And I started reading Arabic, the internet was developing in the 90s. I started reading a lot of Egyptian newspapers that were available in English, and my Arabic is not good enough. But I was reading the words of Muslim Brotherhood intellectuals, Yasser Arafat, and political leaders of the day that were speaking in European languages in one way and then they were speaking in Arabic in another way. And I started to realize that the Muslim Brotherhood, right, which is, you'll hear about it all week from different experts, but they play a very important political, ideological role in many societies, including the United States, as we'll unpack in our work. And that this ideology, or this political social movement, or reactionary social movement, puts together European anti-Semitism and even Nazism with a very particular understanding of Islam, right? So political Islam is not Islam, it's not Muslims. It's a reactionary social movement that takes European anti-Semitism and Islam and sort of fuses it together as a reaction to British colonialism to fight, to get rid of the British colonial powers in Egypt. It emerges in Egypt 100 years ago. So like my naivete back in the day when I couldn't believe that apartheid existed in my lifetime, here I was reading about a social movement that takes Nazism and European anti-Semitism and fuses it with a very narrow understanding of religion, of Islam, and is the engine that's propelling a reaction to regimes in the Middle East. It's the foundational ideology of the Palestinian national movement, Hamas, but also the PLO, and starting to realize that this legacy of ideas exist. And then I'm studying this, I'm learning about this, and started writing papers about it. And then I was invited by my comrades, right? Because I studied in England, I had all these, fellow students and professors, and we were, fighting apartheid together and writing about issues of racism and anti-Semitism together. So I was invited to the Tate Gallery. One of my comrades was the first black curator of the Tate Gallery, and he had a whole program on Orientalism and race, and he invited me to speak. And, I came happily along, tracing the European racist and anti-Semitic and even Nazi ideology to the Muslim Brotherhood. And I figured my comrades who were involved in the struggle against apartheid and supporting a social democratic revolution in South Africa to rid the apartheid racist regime with the social democracy of the ANC and other groups that were fighting apartheid. These were social democrats expanding notions of democracy and citizenship to all citizens of South Africa, not just white people, not to segregate people, that we were all struggling for a democracy. That's why I joined the anti-apartheid movement. So I started getting into this stuff at the presentation at the Tate Gallery, and I actually needed a police escort to take me out of there, literally. And my comrades stopped, except for one person, stopped speaking to me because I was a Zionist, and they didn't realize that I was that type of Jew. Okay, so I still speak to one friend. We argue and debate in the best of tradition of scholarship. We disagree on many issues, but he's a friend and he's a scholar, so we debate ideas. And I think this shock, Raymond Aron, the great sociologist from France, says that in every generation the Jews are mugged. We have these ideas, these philosophies, and every generation we're mugged. So here I was, a social democrat, a human rights advocate, exposing the connections between the Muslim Brotherhood and the protocols of the Elders of Zion, for example. And Elie Wiesel, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, very important professor on these issues. I'm sure many of you have come across his work. He always argued that, first of all, that anti-Semitism is not a parochial Jewish or Israeli problem. That once anti-Semitism is unleashed in the world, it knows no boundaries. And that it's a vicious form of hatred. It's like a virus. And once it's unleashed, other groups will be affected by this form of hatred. So it's not a parochial problem. And he also, always used to teach that words and ideas, the words and ideas created the Holocaust. The Holocaust didn't begin with the railroad tracks and the crematoriums. It began with words and ideas. And the words and ideas of the protocols of the elders of Zion that spoke about all these conspiracies about Jews and Jewish power. And, you know, you'll hear more about it during the next 2 weeks. That it was the words and ideas that created the Holocaust. And these words and ideas are still alive and well today. They are promoted by the Muslim Brotherhood and its offshoots of political Islamist organizations. And in this sort of postmodern space of progressive intellectuals, or apparently progressive intellectuals, who try to oppose notions of Western hegemony and the power of the West over the colonized rest, that they are at one level opposed to Western domination, and there's merit in that. We can speak about that later. But there's sort of, we call this the red-green alliance, that progressive, feminists, gay, minorities, intellectuals who are opposed to Western hegemony actually are in bed with the other advocates of ending Western hegemony, mainly these sort of reactionary social movements in the Middle East and North Africa, and even in the West. But this is sort of the red-green alliance. In the name of anti-Western hegemony, you have this strange alliance of progressive, in quotations, postmodernist, and reactionary social forces. And the only thing, in my view, that they have in common is their notion of anti-Western hegemony and their anti-Semitism. And it's the anti-Semitism of these reactionary social forces that I would argue is at the forefront of contemporary anti-Semitism, and they're re-emerging because of the crisis in neoliberal globalization, which I'll speak about tomorrow. So the conditions are ripe for these very different social movements, or sort of have this alliance, the red-green alliance, in which anti-Semitism is at its core. So, and then of course there's the right-wing anti-Semitism, the Nazis that were mentioned, and the white supremacists, and the nationalists, which also are attacking the center in the United States, in Europe, and other places. So you have these three extreme movements that are attacking the center, and I think are gaining credibility because of the crisis that exists in the global economy, and as a result in the states and institutions that held society together for a long time. So you have the extreme Islamists, you have the white supremacists that are emerging, and you have the sort of postmodern intellectuals that are in the institutions in which we function. So I know in Colorado, you give an example of fascists going to school, but most fascists aren't in the classroom. They may show up on campus here and there, but it's the dehumanization of who Jews are, of what Israel is, and what Jewish peoplehood is, that is being attacked in our sort of liberal intellectual spaces of our best educational institutions and in the media of record. And this, to me, is the challenge of us as intellectuals, as scholars, as professors. How do we operate in this space that is increasingly hostile to Jewish faculty and to Jewish students? How do we as intellectuals come up with a response? How do we map and decode and understand the processes which are being kind of laid out in front of us? How do we respond intellectually? And how do we respond, I'd say as active intellectuals? During the anti-apartheid movement, I was operating with amazing professors and intellectuals and graduate students and undergraduate students fighting apartheid, and we were acting with the best legacy, if you will, of what it means to be an intellectual, to engage society, to stand up for what is right, to stand against racism, to stand against exclusion, to stand against the dehumanization of groups of people. And yet it's the intellectuals that are in bed with the Islamists. I'm not saying about Muslims. I'm not saying, or Islam, but political Islam, the Islamists. So when Princeton University, I just found out, is having a course that dehumanizes Israel, right? Who are they supporting? When Judith Butler stands up and says that we have to understand Hezbollah and Hamas as being part of the progressive global left, what is she speaking about? How can a reactionary social movement of Hezbollah and Hamas that literally plagiarize from the protocols of the elders of Zion, they plagiarize. If they were in my class, I'd kick them out of the school for plagiarism. They plagiarize the protocols of the elders of Zion and speak about Jews and Israel in the most genocidal ways. The protocols lay the foundation of the Holocaust. They lay the foundation of excluding Jews from institutions. It lay the foundation of explaining why Jews should be forcibly put into ghettos. It lay the intellectual foundations of explaining why Jews should be put on trains and moved to labor camps, to concentration camps, and ultimately in the final solution. This is the crap that is being peddled in social movements from South Africa to the United States, to Europe, and it's being echoed in our best universities. So, if Israel is an apartheid state, then from a liberal, intellectual, human rights, postmodern, progressive position, Israel must be dismantled. Because if Israel is an apartheid state, it's a crime against humanity. So when these intellectuals parade themselves and say Israel is an apartheid state, then from a liberal human rights perspective, we're obligated to dismantle it. So the self-determination of the Jewish people on their homeland doesn't exist. And this is in Princeton, this is in Oxford, it's at the Sorbonne. It's our best university. And this is what's at stake. And it's frightening. In 1983, Edward Said said that he's the last remaining Jewish intellectual. The Palestinians are the Jews and the Israelis are the Nazis. And that he is the inheritor of Adorno and Horkheimer, of their intellectual legacy, and he's the last Jewish intellectual, and the American Jewish scholars have become fat scribes in the suburbs of America. Now, in 1983, to say he's the last Jewish intellectual, it was outrageous. It was ridiculous. It didn't make sense. In 2023, it makes sense. Intellectuals are teaching that the Israelis are the Nazis, the Jews are white supremacists, and that the Palestinians are the oppressed Jewish people and need to be liberated against fascism and against apartheid. This is inversion theory. This is deeply connected to the anti-Semitism of the church. Think about it. This is replacement theology. And this is why, in my humble opinion, it goes so deep and resonates so powerfully in Western society, in Western Christian society, that has been rooted in anti-Semitism, of replacement theology, that the stubborn Jew still exists and needs to be replaced by the church, by the new covenant. Said, a Christian person from the region, is saying that he's the real authentic Jew. But my people have heard this for 2,000 years. So think about it. Think how these things resonate. So to the irrationality of hatred has to be legitimized, right? And I'll go to my final point, and then I'm going to give the floor to Joel and Marcus. But the title of this introductory talk is the importance of creating contemporary critical anti-Semitism studies. We know in the last 40 or 50 years there's been, thankfully, the creation of centers, of institutes, of curriculum on issues of racism. Issues of racism only became legitimate areas of study in the United States of America in the late 50s and early 60s when historians at Yale University began to recognize racism. And I'm not speaking about the historically black universities and colleges. Of course, Du Bois, and there's a whole legacy of all kinds of work that was going on in those universities, but not in the mainstream universities. Robert Park didn't talk about racism. The Chicago School of Thought banned Du Bois because he was speaking about racism, and the Chicago School of Thought was not speaking about it. It was an issue that was sort of not tolerated. So it's only in the 1960s and 70s where institutes and scholars are engaging racism and the legacy of racism, of colonialism, and how the colonialists broke people up into different groups of race, of inferiority and superiority, of the legacy of slavery in the Americas, of how language are concepts, and how concepts in our everyday speech are sometimes racist, how our cities are segregated, how our places of employment are segregated, right? So you have a liberal education today, you know stuff about racism, you know things about sexism. Now they're beginning to deal with issues of queer studies. We're learning about homophobia. And as many of you were saying earlier, today, issues of anti-Semitism, the longest hatred of Western civilization, right? We don't have the material. We have wonderful stuff on the Holocaust, tragically. We have descriptive work on contemporary anti-Semitism, but we don't have a framework to understand the language of anti-Semitism, how it causes segregation, how it causes othering, the socioeconomic, political, and cultural processes and the reemergence of anti-Semitism, the language of anti-Semitism, how Jewish students and faculty are being marginalized at our best universities and why. So if young Jewish students and faculty members are connected to the Zionist project or Israel, they have family and friends in Israel, or they think that Jews are like other people entitled to the self-determination in their land, like other people, that somehow you're a problem. You're enemy number one in this progressive postmodern space. And it's reflective in our curriculum, it's reflective in the culture of our universities and our media of record. And I'll just end, I can go on for a long time, but I'll end by one more comment. We have this amazing woman, her name is Eliza Landau. She's a Holocaust survivor, originally from Poland, she lives in Israel. She made it to Israel, she had a family, she had a few children, she has grandchildren now. She lives in Tel Aviv. And she tells the story of the Holocaust, of what happened to her family. So as we know, there's Christian anti-Semitism, there's racist forms of anti-Semitism, and now there's the attack on who Jews are as a people. So it's almost like the three main phases. There's theology, race, and people. It's like an onion. So there's different types of anti-Semitism. So we know the racist form of anti-Semitism during the Holocaust was permeated European society. It permeated the halls of education. The best philosophers, the best theologians, the best scientists, the scholars of eugenics wrote about the Jews. It was the intellectuals that justified the Holocaust, that justified notions of race. Right? So we know the damage that this has caused and how racism, anti-Semitic racism affected European Jewry. So Eliza speaks about how her brothers and sisters and father, her mother was missing at that time, were lined up by SS officers in front of a pit. And just before they were about to be shot, her father pushed her in the pit, and she was saved. Everybody else was killed. She was malnourished at that time and very weak. She eventually crawled out from under the bodies and crawled to a farm. And this Polish Catholic family in a farm nursed her back to life. They hid her at great peril because anybody who was hiding Jews in those days, the entire family would be killed by the Nazis. To make a long story short, she was reunited with her mother. Her mother survived, and the two of them went to Israel, where they have a family. And she speaks to us. In her lifetime, as a Jewish woman, a Jewish girl, her family was exterminated because the Jews were poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. And you can't convert, right? The scholars, the intellectuals, the scientists, the theologians believed that race was innate. Even if you master languages and master culture, if you're racially Jewish, there's no escape. You're Jewish. Every group was inherently, there's no escape. It was scientifically proven. So her family and her people and her community were exterminated for poisoning the purity of the white Aryan race. They had to be eliminated to save the race. Today, in her lifetime, in her life, she is being accused of being a quintessential white supremacist, apartheid-supporting fascist. In her lifetime. And then you have these intellectual clowns at our best universities. They're clowns, defining the Jew as white. And it's not, we're white and we're very terribly sorry for what happened. As a good liberal Oxford graduate said, terribly sorry. And welcome to the club. It's terrible what happened. Welcome to the club. You're white now. No. We have now replaced the colonial, racist, fascist that ran Africa and the Americas and Asia and the Middle East for centuries. And the Jew is the quintessential epitome of what a white supremacist apartheid supporter is. And here's small Elisa Landau in her life being accused of supporting apartheid. And this is being justified not just by the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranian revolutionary regime. This is being justified by the best scholars and thinkers and philosophies at our best universities. So what do we do? This is a challenge. And this is why we are arguing at ISGAP it's essential that scholars come together and create a framework, like the study of race, like the study of sexism and gender studies, to come up with an interdisciplinary, deeply high-level scholarly language of understanding, unpacking, mapping contemporary anti-Semitism. Because, ladies and gentlemen, if this continues at our finest universities, if our best students are being schooled to think that Jews are public enemy number one, that we are white supremacists, we support the apartheid system in Israel, the future is going to be increasingly difficult. And it's up to intellectuals to grapple with these issues and come up with at least a framework to understand the processes. And not to simply describe them, but to look at how power and shifting global relations and economic, social, cultural processes are impacting on this issue. And I think it goes back to what Elie Wiesel said always, that the Jews are the canary in the coal mine. The rise of anti-Semitism is, I believe, an early warning system. It's an early warning system for the deterioration of not only democracy, but human decency. And what do we do? Some of us are obviously here, so people in this room are sensitive to this challenge. So what do we do? How do we take this up a notch and come up with comprehensive understandings? This is why we need to create a framework, like others have created frameworks, like Stuart Hall. I think he was brilliant in understanding issues of race and culture and the colonial legacy on culture. So to come up with perspectives like this. So this is our challenge. So on this note, it's my honor to introduce Joel Kotek to you. Joel, as you know, he's a senior research fellow here at ISGAP. He's also a professor at the Political Science Free University of Brussels in Belgium and at the Institut d'études politiques in Paris. So it's an honor, and Joel, his talk is Anti-Semitism as Conspiracy Theory from Judas Pilate, apropos of what's going on in social media. We just heard about how the Jews killed Jesus, apparently. So from Judas Pilate to COVID-19.
Exactly.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. So we'll try to be able to complete my lecture, and especially as I told you, I'm not an English speaker. So I will try to explain actually the difference between anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, etc. And I will also explain through the example of the coronavirus crisis, etc. And so the coronavirus crisis confirmed Leon Poliakov's model that in situations of uncertainties and distress that cause fear and even panic, Jews find themselves accused of being the cause. Leon Poliakov was, I would say, and still is, I would say, the most important historian on anti-Semitism, etc. And so he created a concept called causalité diabolique, diabolical causality. And to understand what is happening, what happened actually with the COVID-19 crisis, he refers to a concept that was called diabolical causality, etc. This concept makes it possible to understand why an unforeseen and disturbing phenomenon of natural origin inevitably leads to the scaffolding of conspiracy theory, and this is important, of course, more than often anti-Semitic. The conspiracy emerges from an archaic mentality that intends to provide a paranoid explanatory system, but all in all reassuring. The disease cannot be a chance, but proceeds from a criminal conspiracy, and in the case, as we remember, of the COVID-19, it was a kind of Judeo-Zionist plot. Of course, as we know, the Jews were not alone in the dock. There was a general increase in xenophobia as countries have closed their borders, let's remember, and for instance, Asian people were also targeted, etc. But still, the Jews were the main defendants, the first accused. And an example, because I'm a collector of anti-Semitic cartoons and illustration, etc. And this is an example, that you could find on the internet, telling that it was definitely not a Chinese disease, but it was a Jewish flu, etc. And this is again, and you could find hundreds of examples of how the Jews were accused of being responsible of COVID-19, etc. And again, hi Chinese friend, etc. Well, according to a calculation, it sure looks like Israel has unleashed a bioweapon meant to teach you that they control your destiny as well, etc. And this is Al-Quds, Palestinian daily newspaper, printed in East Jerusalem, who presented coronavirus as an Israeli and United States conspiracy against Iran and, of course, against China, etc. And this is, and I can show you hundreds of examples like this. This is, of course, a newspaper from Tehran, from Iran, etc. So the question is why? And of course, the question is, of course, it's obvious the Jews were always considered as the scapegoat of Western civilization, etc. And it's true that the crystallization of persecution on an individual is often associated with the phenomenon of the scapegoat, who was highlighted by René Girard, who actually made his career in California because he was not recognized in France. And what does it mean? All against one manifests itself through the process of scapegoating that allows the group to reunite against a person through the sharing of a hateful emotion. And you can say, well, why not? Actually, yes. And this is a good illustration of scapegoating, etc. This is Abel Pan, very famous illustrator, who actually finally fled Russia to go to Israel. He immigrates, and it explains it's 1915, during the war, the First World War, and you can see that France accusing Germany, Germany, Britain, Britain, Turkey, Turkey, Russian Empire, family, they all agree it's the fault of the Jews, and you can see. And this is really, exactly, this is another illustration, illustrating, you know, the same process, but for the Second World War. Before, has been made by a very good illustrator, actually, who killed himself in 1914 when the Germans entered France. Wolf, and also he explained that, of course, everyone was pleased to design, to show the Jews as being responsible of what will become the Second World War, etc. So the question is, okay, Jews as ideal scapegoat. And you can say, is it enough? And you can say yes and no. I think it's too simple. An example, for instance, is the fact that in France, in 1940, there were 3 million foreigners, 3 million strangers, 3 million aliens, and 10% of them were Jews, and only the Jews were targeted, even not the gypsies. The gypsies were put in concentration camp, but they were not delivered to the Germans. Only the Jews finally, you know, went into the final solution, etc. And this is the same in Belgium, etc. So there is something special. So Jews were not chosen as scapegoat because they were just the other, the weak, or the different. Actually, most of the Jews in France were French. They had the French nationality. They were not foreigners. But because, and this is obvious, just because they were Jews. Not because they were weak. Because in history, we know that sometimes the Jews were not so weak, etc. So the question is, why? Because they were the cause of the evil since the 12th century. So we have to go back to, I would say, an historical explanation. Why they were chosen as scapegoat? Because, and I will explain to you, it's a kind of cultural code of Western civilization. Didn't they plot, as you're told, didn't they plot against Christ before they murder him? And this is the famous, what we call the deicide, you know, the ultimate crime. They kill God, etc. And this is a British representation of the plot against Jesus, and you can see that the Sanhedrin, you know, the wives of Zion, you can say, presented Jesus to Ponce Pilate, and look how the Jews looked like. And we are in the 13th century, we're not in 19th or 20th century, etc. They look, you know, they're ugly, and look how Jesus is. Jesus looked like, I would say, an Australian surfer, you know. He's wonderful, but he's a Jew too. And look how Ponce Pilatus, I think this is how you can call in English, looks like. He is a Jew. He wears the Jewish hat, etc. But I will explain to you tomorrow, etc. I will focus on this. I have no time. So anti-Semitism, as we know, as certain people worked on this topic, is a Christian cultural code, active since the 13th century, and the main principle is blame the Jews, blame the evil Jews, etc. And this is the big difference between ordinary, if I can speak like this, racism and xenophobia. Anti-Semitism is first a demonological, you know, how would you say, demonological accusation, etc. And again, let's go back to the Middle Age. Again, it's not a 19th century French representation. It's not a Nazi representation of the Stürmer. It's a Middle Age, medieval representation of the Jews, you know, being in contact directly with the devil to destroy Christian society, etc. And of course, which are dedicated to go to hell at the end of the time, etc. And this is the 12th, well, magnifique. And this, of course, will explain the Jews, the representation of the Jews during the Second World War. This is a poster of the very famous Nazi film, The Ewige Jude, and this is, of course, the German original poster and its version in Flemish for the Dutch-speaking people, Flanders and Holland, etc. And you can see how the Jews were portrayed. And this is anthropological. This is cultural, and this is the last issue of Kladderadatsch, actually who used to be an illustrative magazine created by Jews in the 19th century, and who became, of course, pro-Nazi, of course, were controlled by the Nazi. And this is the last cover, And you can see Roosevelt, President of the United States, you know, being within the hand of the Jews. But there were no more Jews in Europe. Most of them were already killed, etc. So the basic idea, the Jews are responsible for the misfortunes of the world. And so, of course, anti-Semitism doesn't speak about the Jews, but of society in crisis, or not only in crisis, in mutation. And anti-Semitism should be considered as a social disease, as an individual and collective psychosis, etc. And it's good that we have a psychiatrist who will help me to understand this. So anti-Semitism is first and of all a conspiracy theory which aims to designate the Jews as responsible for the world misfortune, and this is a very common motto that you could find hundreds, thousands of times in the 19th century, before even the birth of Adolf Hitler, saying the Juden sind unser Unglück, the Jews are responsible of, you can say, what went wrong, all the problem we have. And so Germany was defeated in the First World War. It was because of the Jews. The Dolchschloss, you know, they were betrayed by the Jews, etc. And this is, you know, an Austrian postcards, and you can see that how they represent the Austrian Republic. It's a Jewish republic, ugly Jewish republic actually, etc. So remember that the defeat was caused by the Jews, and which is this explanation of, you could also find in contemporary issues. For instance, this is a very important Turkish newspaper who said that the Jews were responsible of what? Of the Armenian genocide, with the help of the Freemason, etc. And of course, the Jews were responsible of Daesh, ISIS, etc. And this is actually funny because they show a picture of a man, I suppose, in a bar, and they pretend that he is a Jew called Sam Elliott, of course, and so it's always the same, that the Jews are controlling the world and are responsible of the misfortune. Yesterday they killed the Christ. They tried to poison Mohammed, that's the prophet, and now they are organizing on false flag, as you can see, the Syria civil war, and all the attacks that were supposed to be Islamist, etc. So the difference with ordinary racism is the Jews help to explain the existence of evil. And it's important because if you believe in God and if you see the situation is not so good, despite the fact that the crisis came to save us, you need the existence of the devil to justify the fact that, well, things doesn't go so well. And this is the importance of having Jews within society, etc. So, as I said, anti-Semitism is therefore more than just racism or xenophobia. As I said, it's a cultural code that affects even society without Jews. And of course, when I speak to my students, I would ask them, how many Jews you believe there were in Germany in 1933 when Hitler came to power? And they would say millions. They would say 20%. They would say 30% of the German population, etc. As you know, they were less than 1%. They were less than 1%. And despite this, they were designated as the responsible of the misfortune of Germany, etc. And so this is of course, anti-Semitism is funny. We can laugh a lot about anti-Semitism because it's so absurd. So this is, for instance, a so-called Japanese historian who pretend that, you know, Enola Gay, who was the bombers responsible of Hiroshima, that in fact Enola Gay means in Yiddish, kill the emperor, which is funny in a sense. As you remember, of course, Enola Gay was the name of the mother of the pilot, etc. But this exists, and he wrote a bestseller, etc. And there are 1,000 Jews in Japan. And also, as I said, I'm working on a lot of Africa and all the conflicts in the Great Lakes, Africa, etc. And there is also conspiracy theory that the Rwanda, the Tutsis, are controlled by the Zionists, etc. There is a Zionist Tutsi conspiracy to control, etc., all of Africa, etc. So, as I said, anti-Semitism is a conspiracy theory which aims to designate Jews as the real mass of the world. And this is a big difference with racism. Nobody will say the black or the female or the gypsies or whatsoever are controlling the world. Of course not. The Jews are, and we spoke about the protocol of the wives of Zion, etc. All this is all the covers, and you see the satanic, how the Jews are represented, etc. They're not represented as subhuman, as undermensch, untermensch, etc. But they are represented as evil, etc. Satanic people, you know, trying to destroy what we like. And this is an example during the Second World War. It's a poster which show that the Jews and the Mason are plotting against Europe, Christian Europe, etc. And you can see on one side Stalin, communism, on the other side Winston Churchill. It means you can say what else, capitalism, etc. And even today, I've been working on a quite famous American illustrator, David Dees, who actually died 2 years ago. And this man pretend that the great replacement, you know, is a Jewish plot against and to destroy white people. It's a way for the Jews to genocide white people, etc. And this is a poster, an illustration that he show. And of course, he won't speak about Jews. He will use the word Zionist because it's better to say the Zionists instead of the Jews. And you can say the Zionist Jew agenda used massive illegal immigration in US and EU to destroy the white race. And this is also a good example. You can see all the leaders. You can see Merkel. You can see David Cameron, etc., Sarkozy, and immigrants, Zionist weapon of European genocide, Zionist puppet Merkel, etc., Zionist unleashed total white race destruction. It's quite funny when you understand, of course, that it's absurd. And this is Macron, president of France, and you could see that everything is there. Macron, of course, is a puppet of the Jews, and you can see he's a puppet, and is, of course, controlled by the House of Rothschild. He read the Protocol of the Wives of Zion because this is why, and he is organizing white genocide. And of course, he is a Freemason. And this is the Freemasonry, you know, sign, etc. So everything is there, if you want. And this has been issued in June 2022. So it means last year. And actually, I will be one of the witnesses as a historian to the plot in France, in Avignon. And this was shown in Avignon, a very famous city in France. They organize the most famous theatrical festival in France, and you can see that Attali, you don't know him, is the equivalent of Soros. Attali, you know, he is a Jewish liberal, etc., intellectual who used to be actually member of the Socialist Party, controlling Macron. And Macron, and he has white gloves, and white gloves, it means they were Freemasons, etc. So it's a very famous Freemason, Jewish Freemason conspiracy theory, etc. So the major difference between ordinary racism and xenophobia, the Jews are not subhuman, they are inhuman. They constitute, as Hitler would have said, a Gegenrasse. It means they are satanic, dangerous, harmful. They're not human. They compare them as a kind of microbe and therefore to be eliminated. And this is how they will represent the Jews in actually then the Nazi magazine like the Stürmer, etc., as rats, etc., and mocking the Jews. That, of course, the Jews wanted to leave Germany after 1938 Kristallnacht, and nobody wants them, nobody wanted to welcome them, etc. So the mockery, and then you can see also, you know, this is a, how would I say, a manual distributed not to the SS, but to the plain German soldiers. We are in 1944, almost all the Jews were already killed in Europe, and der Jude als Weltparasit. A Jew is not someone that should be enslaved. No, it should be eliminated, and this is different between concentration camp and extermination center. You know, in Birkenau, or not in Birkenau, but let's say in Sobibor, in Treblinka, you could live only 1 hour, or maximum 1 day, because they were killed the day of the arrival, etc. And people make a confusion between concentration camp and extermination center, etc. And then you can see, look, in the eyes, you can see dollar, capitalism, and on the other one, communism, etc. So, and this another example of a book, especially, you know, written for German education, Die Juden is a Weltpest. The Jews are the pest, and those are posters. Actually, they were posted in occupied Poland. Well, and it's the same. You know, it represents that the Jews are, we say, nuisible in the pest. What do you say? Rats, microbes, lice, fleas, etc. And you can. How could you deal with those people? There's only one way: penicillin, killing, etc. And this is a poster, quite interesting. In France, of course, during the war, tuberculosis, syphilis, cancer can be cured, but not the Jews. The Jews cannot be cured. And of course, you can understand why, finally, Pétain regime did collaborate with the Germans and did send all the Jews to the concentration camp. And this also, to make a bit of fun, this is a demonstration in front of the, I think, the Israeli consulate in New York, and you can see that, you know, death to all Jews. No, it's not funny? I think it's funny, which also shows the ignorance of the people who actually oppose us. So, let's, and I will almost finish. Going back to Corona. So, a report published by Tel Aviv University found that the coronavirus pandemic has become the vector of an exceptionally intense wave of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionist propaganda accusing Jews, Israel, and both of causing or benefiting from the virus. And I will show you some example, etc. The Jews in all are the most dangerous because the Jews is invisible like the virus, etc. And so what we call deconfinement, it means we have witnessed a deconfinement of Jews' hatred mixed with the inhibited assertion that of the worst conspiracy theory, etc. And this is a good example. The Minister of Health in France was Jewish. Actually, her father, who died 6 months ago, was a survivor of Auschwitz, the only survivor of his family. And look how she was portrayed. She was accused of being responsible of COVID-19 epidemic in France. And she doesn't look really like this. Of course, they exaggerate her nose. And of course, it reminds us of what? Of the medieval accusation, of course. So you understand that if you do not study history, you cannot understand modern anti-Semitism, etc. And this was also, it's in France, and it's not, and this was it was shown in demonstration against, you know, the vaccination. And people say that genocide Gaulois, it means that the purpose of COVID-19 was to organize a genocide against the white race. And this is in France. The genocide of the Goyim. And this was in Nancy. This was in France, etc. This is something that I wouldn't be able to invent because it's something which seems to be so strange. And again, like this is in America actually. In Columbus, Ohio, the real plague is the Jews. This is, if you could have seen COVID-19 under a microscope, this is what you would have found. You know, of course, you can see that the virus is wearing kippah. And even in Poland, and you can see it's a mixture. The Jews are responsible not only of COVID-19, but also of the rest. Homosexuality, all, you know, the disease of, I would say, postmodern and even the genre theory, which is absurd, but this is what happened, etc. Of course, David Duke, thus President Donald Trump has coronavirus. Are Israel and the global Zionist elite up to their old tricks? You know that he was connected to the Ku Klux Klan, etc. A Palestinian newspaper who would publish the cartoons of David adapted to the mimic of the virus, etc. Zionism being, of course, the real virus, destroying humanity, etc., and whatsoever. And of course, not only they create the virus, but they create it to make money. And this is, of course, Jewish capitalism, etc. You know, that the most important thing is, and this is a British, actually, illustration, you know, the Jews have created coronavirus just to collect money, etc. Not only to organize a genocide, but also to make money. And I think I've almost finished, etc. And of course, they will accuse in France, they would have accused Jacques Attali. In America, they would have accused Soros, who is considered, and also professors to be suspected of having created. And you can see Israeli linked Dr. Lieber, who was actually professor at Harvard University, arrested, he was never arrested, for receiving payment and smuggling biomaterial to Wuhan University. It's an absurd accusation, but it's like this. And this is in Turkey. This is Fatih Erbakan, the son of the leader of the founder of Islamic Party Refa, actually who formed Erdogan, and he said, although we lack evidence, this virus serves the objective of Zionism to reduce the population and prevent it from growing. And he said, Zionism is a 5,000 years old bacterium causing people suffering. 5,000, even Jewish people, there's no 5,000 years, etc. existence. But it's irrational, and it's obsessional. And this makes actually the study of anti-Semitism, I would say, fascinating. Iranian thing, Iranian cartoons showing that again, America and Israel created the virus. Again, you can see the sign of Israel state, etc., the menorah. And I finished two more, and to show, the really the psychotic aspect, I would say, of anti-Semitism. It's a sermon by a Yemeni scholar who said coronavirus is part of a plan by the Jews, Israel, US to control Mecca, Medina. And he said the Saud clan is a Jewish family brought into power in order to Judaize this city. Well, how could you respond to this? You cannot. You cannot. And the same Houthi, another Houthi politician, well, there's a politician, the Jews, US are behind coronavirus pandemic. We should unite it in jihad against the Jews. Enmity towards them is an identifying characteristic of Muslim. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joel. So next is Marcus Roberts.
Marcus will say.
Joel, thank you.
Like this? No?
No, we'll have
Oh
Marcus
my
say
God,
it.
sorry.
So Marcus is going to speak on anti-Semitism and the
Yes.
challenge of Holocaust remembrance in the United Kingdom. And as Marcus, I'm sure, will explain, he's done really groundbreaking work despite tremendous opposition to silence him. I remember I heard about this project for the first time like 3 years ago, and it's amazing that Marcus succeeded in his work. So the floor is yours.
Could you take some pictures for my propaganda?
Yeah.
I'm delighted to be invited here. Pembroke's my old college, and I was very delighted, in fact, to be put into Staircase 17, which is House 14, which is actually the site of the house of Rabbi Moses of Bristol, a medieval rabbi in Oxford. We're actually just on the edge of the medieval Jewish quarter here. So just by saying that, by the way, I've now changed your consciousness of this physical space. Have I not? And I can say to you, when you go past the town hall in 1226 and 1228, the town hall site was expropriated from two Oxford Jews and given to the town council. So a lot of my job is about providing accurate information which changes people's consciousness of things, accurate information relating to places. So that's very much the work that we do in the in J-Trails. What I'm going to talk to you today, really, I didn't choose to get really involved in this. It kind of happened to me. But I suppose in a way, some of the influences I had back in the day in Oxford have also kind of encouraged and inspired me. You were here for the Simon Wiesenthal, yeah, because I spent a couple of days with Simon Wiesenthal when he came to Oxford. The thing that impressed me about him was what he said. He said, I was just an architect in, I think, Minsk. He said if the war hadn't happened, the Holocaust hadn't happened, he'd still have been designing houses, and we wouldn't have heard of Simon Wiesenthal unless he became a famous architect. But what he said at the town hall meeting was, when he was liberated, he was on his stretcher in a weak condition, and he, in the space of a couple of days, drew up 50 indictments against different guards and personnel at the camp. he said he couldn't understand why the other survivors who were in similar condition were just saying nothing, unable to act. And he said, this was so wrong. I had to do something about it. So the thing that impressed me about Wiesel was that he was an ordinary person who found himself in an extraordinary situation and felt that he needed to do something about it because nobody else was. And that's always been, I think, something of an influence on me. Now, I'm going to start by asking you just a few questions. So, can you sort of nod your head or raise your hand or however you wish to indicate it? So, I'm going to ask a question. Did the Holocaust happen on British soil? So, yes, if you did, who says yes? Who, sorry? Yeah, you see, you've got specialist knowledge, you see. So, who's not aware that the Holocaust was on British soil? Is that most of you or some of you? So, and how many of you are aware that there was the westernmost SS concentration camp in Europe on British soil, on Alderney, Origny, in the Channel Islands? How many are aware of that? And where did you find out about that? Obviously, you've got specialist knowledge.
In the potato, like the sweet potato Guernsey book. Like it was a novel that I read that happened to show it.
That's interesting. And other sources?
It was a good novel.
Yeah, very good novel, I said. And I mean, were you who is aware that Jews from across Europe, but also a large group of French Jews, were deported via Drancy to Alderney, to Origny, to an SS run camp? Many of you aware of that? Yeah. Now, I've raised all these issues, and often to British Jews when I speak at the Limud conference, and I say to them, they say to me, why haven't we heard this before? Why isn't this taught in our schools? One of my trustees for J-Trails went on a trip to the Imperial War Museum, and they have a very, very good Holocaust section, well worth going to see. I said, please check the map of the Holocaust. They have a superb map of Holocaust. And what is indicated on the section showing the Channel Islands? Nothing. So you're also aware, by the way, of the National Holocaust Memorial Project, which was instituted in 2016 by David Cameron, and they're going to have a big memorial in Westminster, in Victoria Gardens, next to the Houses of Parliament. You're aware of that? That's a kind of it's a political project, really. But what I found is that the British government only wants to talk about kinder transport, Nicholas Winton, and the Windermere boys. It's all sunny uplands, Weren't we good? No mention of Alderney. We don't. Oh, and by the way, and the rest of the Channel Islands. If you think Alderney was bad, then there was a lot else going on in the Channel Islands, in Jersey and Guernsey and Sark as well. So they've been reluctant to talk about that issue. And the reason I'm speaking today is they've just declared a public inquiry into the numbers of deaths that occurred in the Alderney camps. That has largely come about because I've been on their case about it for the last, I've been campaigning on this for the last 10 years. But because of taking the chair of the IHRA in 2024, they realised that people like me are going to make mincemeat of them for being Holocaust hypocrites. How can you take the chair of the IHRA, an internationally respected Holocaust information, when you are not talking about the Holocaust that occurred in British sovereign territory, and also you've still got secret Holocaust files? That's been the other aspect of my campaign. I've been calling for still closed files to be opened. And there was a promise made by Boris Johnson at PMQs 2 years ago. He said, "Oh yes, they're ready to go. They'll be in queue by January 2021." Did they arrive? No. So this is a little bit of the background of what's going on. I mean, a lot of my work actually started with the Channel Islands back in 2009 because I was introduced to an archaeologist who was going to do a PhD on Jewish mass graves on Alderney. And Dr. Roger White, her supervisor, said to me, you know, you're doing very similar work. I was at that stage doing work on the camps in the Noord-Pas-de-Calais, so where a lot of Belgian Jews were sent there before them being sent via Mechelen to Auschwitz. And I used to work closely with David Shento, who died recently, but one of the survivors. And he said, you know, this is important work she's doing. However, please dissuade her from digging up a Jewish mass grave. So my first contact with Alderney was with the work of this archaeologist. She worked out an ethical guideline with us, with myself and the rabbis I work with, the European Committee for the Preservation of Jewish Cemeteries. They're Haredi rabbis, very good people. She agreed to a non-intrusive method of archaeological investigation. She desperately wanted a letter of recommendation from me and from the rabbis so she could work at Treblinka. And then 3 years later, I saw her documentary about investigating Treblinka, and what was she doing? She was digging into a mass grave near the gas chamber. So we were not best pleased about that. And also, she had been somewhat influenced by an anti-Semite Holocaust denier who runs the Alderney Museum, a chap called Trevor Davenport. It is in the newspaper, so I'm not libeling him. I'm just simply saying something that actually is in print. But when she met him with me, he said to us, if you dare mention the word Alderney, Holocaust and mass grave all in one sentence, I'll have you driven off the island. I mean, it was a really nasty kind of attack. So, and unfortunately, the student concerned decided, he then told her in private to ditch the Jew, basically. And so we ended up parting companies, and she carried on with her work, and away we go. So that's a little bit of background. However, what I need to do is really just to run you through a bit of the history on Alderney, which is of considerable interest, and also some of the campaign that's gone on. I like this quote because this is all about the truth. I get very indignant about people saying things that simply are not true. Why? And there's a great deal of untruth being said about the Channel Islands, and as Churchill said, truth is incontrovertible. Malice may attack it, ignorance may deride it, but in the end, there it is. And that's very much the situation with the history in the Channel Islands. The government, in my view, have tried to make this go away. They've tried to promote a minimising narrative. They've tried to run me off the road lots of times. And at one point, they tried in 2016 to put a giant cable across the Holocaust graves. They were the end clients. They could have called it off any point, but they just let the project going on. And if it wasn't for myself and supporters in the island, and finally a letter that I procured from the chief rabbi saying you can't disturb Jewish graves, they would have gone through the lot. So anyway, so Alderney was the only British territory to be occupied by the Germans. So the British government very kindly abandoned the Channel Islands to the German occupiers. And from an early point, Hitler called for Alderney to become Festung Alderney, and it soon also took on its code name Bauleitung Adolf. Hence, you may have seen the book Adolf Island, and there's also a French documentary called Ile Adolf from 2010. I've just got new information that the first prisoners were there actually from December 1940. The Amsterdam chief of police was arrested, and he was sent there before December 1940. This is, 99% verified. The historians who talk about the Alderney concentration camps always talk about 4 camps. In fact, there were at least 11 camps, and there was a 5th main camp, the first camp, Newtown camp, which was just for Jews. But they don't talk about that. Now, don't ask me why, but they don't. The camps originally on the island were for forced and slave labour. The organisation TOT increasingly took over, and the character of the treatment of the prisoners there was, it would seem, extermination through labour. I mean, as one of the island historians put it to me, he said, Trevor Davenport shouldn't be surprised, this is referring to the Holocaust denier, Trevor shouldn't be surprised that if the Germans brought all these people to Alderney and they didn't feed them and they made them work 14 hours a day doing hard labour and they beat them, he shouldn't be surprised that most of them ended up dying. There is evidence that thousands of prisoners died. Now, the government, the archaeologist I described, in 2016 was appointed with various other people to an so-called IHRA safeguarding group, but they have persisted, for reasons best known to themselves, to persist in saying that only a few hundred died on Alderney. Their current certain figure is 600 to 900. Professor Anthony Gleeson, who's just come back onto the radar, who was part of the war crimes investigation in 1991, was very definitive in saying that he believed that thousands perished. And many of us involved with this simply cannot understand how you can say that only under 1,000 people died when they were involved in constructing 900 concrete constructions in the most abysmal and terrible and torturous conditions. There were slaves from 3 continents, and I would like to flag up here that there were African slaves. So there were Arabs from the French colonies, from Algeria, and also Moroccan Arabs brought in large numbers to the Channel Islands, but also there were black Africans from Senegal. I have been trying to get this onto the radar for the last 3 or 4 years. Nobody will talk about it. They'll take the hook in talking about Jews, but they won't talk about the Africans. I just cannot get it on the radar. So one of the most visible icons, I suppose, of the German occupation is the former Russian cemetery, which was claimed to have only 329 burials. Now, I should explain, at the end of the war, the CID did an initial investigation, and then MI19 came in, and they used a young Captain Panchev to compile a report, and that report ended up concluding that only Russians suffered on Alderney. There was no report on Jews or anyone else. Certainly mentions were made of Jews and so on, but the British government then expressly said that no Jews suffered on Alderney. Interestingly, the cemetery, along with the other Channel Islands cemeteries, was exhumed in 1961 as part of a treaty, and bodies were removed to a German war cemetery, which the Jews felt was a bit insulting. However, I know Ray Godian, a local fisherman who was then a teenager working as a part-time undertaker. He got into the trenches, and he told me definitively that they were only allowed to dig in a small area, and many bones were left behind. They could put their hands into the side of the trenches, and there were still bones to be felt. And far from there just being 329 burials, he told me last year when I saw him, he actually had believed he only had 2 weeks to live at that point. He said at the end of it they took lorry loads of bones from the cemetery in caskets. I said, did you mean just one lorry? He said, no, lorry loads. So something that doesn't quite tally. There were only 8 official Jewish graves, which were said to be of Jewish resistance fighters. But like other locations, for example in Nord-Pas-de-Calais, at the cemetery at Dan, there are 6 Jewish graves, and many more Jews, in all actuality, died there. So there's, in my view, an element of deception involved in this. Certainly more than 8 Jews died. So a quick review of the camps. Oldham is tiny, 3.5 miles by 1.5 miles. And you can see that the SS camp, where was the SS camp gone? Yeah, the SS camp was there. You fly right over it when you fly into Alderney. Welcome to Alderney, fly over SS Lager Silt. The camp for French Jews was Lager Norderney. The original Jewish camp was Newtown. Lager Helgoland was said to be a Russian camp. British intelligence says it was a majority Jewish camp. So this is the other thing. I've read all the original documents, and British intelligence is very specific that there were 600 Jews at an early stage in Helgoland camp. So I just cannot understand why these other historians are simply not reading the evidence as it appears if you review all of the evidence. So I mentioned, sorry? So Germans. The Germans. So the weird thing is, it was the British who covered up for the Germans. And in fact, not a single SS war criminal on Alderney was ever tried for crimes committed in Alderney by the British.
Why did they cover up?
Well, this is a complex question. Part of it was really to do with this issue. Channel Islands was a massive can of worms mixed with plutonium. They'd abandoned the Channel Islands to the Germans. Bad things happened. 2,300 British passport holders were deported to German camps by the Germans. All of the islands had multiple slave labour camps. There's issues of collaboration as well. So one of my Jewish colleagues at Wadston, she's a descendant of Sir Victor Carey, who definitely collaborated with the Germans. And when the British took the islands back, they had to debate whether to hang him or knight him. And Juliet Carey said to me, she said, they decided to knight him because it would do a dishonour to the rest of the islands who had suffered. So there's an issue about collaboration, but also they were trying to curry favour with the Russians because they wanted access to Russian graves on Russian territory, Allied graves. You also got the Cold War creeping in, so that dynamic changed. But also, I think fundamentally, it did not suit the British drive to prevent Aliyah to British mandate Palestine. The British had 20 camps of their own, which were supervised by the Red Cross. There were 55 arrested would-be refugees trying to escape the Holocaust to Palestine, all in British control, in Cyprus, Mauritius, and Africa. Yeah.
Before I get into Q&A, we have like 10 more minutes.
Yeah. Yeah, so there was multiple British camps. So at Beaubassin camp in Mauritius, 8.5% of the camp population died, which is only 1.5% less than the typical death rate in a German forced labour or slave labour setup. So they were not keen to give support, moral support for the Jewish cause by saying, yeah, they tried to kill Jews on British territory as well. This is what I suspect is at the heart of it. But also, at the end of the war, Britain was exhausted. We'd given up our empire for some American ships, on the Lend-Lease. We had really nothing in our arsenal other than our moral reputation as victor, as the good guys. So this was all, so shoveling all the horrible radioactive mess of the Channel Islands under a great big carpet of secrecy was the way forward. And that has become, in my view, an ideological position right to the present day. So the reason why the British government has proven to be such a difficult nut to crack is because it's ideological. I think Hannah Arendt said something about, when you've got a situation was just too horrible. You just have to rearrange the facts to accommodate it. And this seems to be the case. And now, of course, the British government, in my view, have painted themselves into a corner with this Holocaust memorial. It's very, very late for them to admit that there are substantial grey areas in our response to the Holocaust. It's politically very tricky. I mean, I wrote to King Charles to suggest that when he goes on his official visit to Alderney, he should pop over from the end of the runway and pay his respects for the fallen prisoners and Jews at SS Lager Sylt. But I knew by writing that was creating a challenge. As monarch and also the sovereign in the Channel Islands, he should have been able to just do that as a matter of respect. That's what the king does. You know, he goes and that memorialises. But I knew that his advisor would immediately say that's going to be a political problem. And that's partly also, in my view, possibly why this inquiry has been called. It's about sanitising the way so that the king can go and visit. So I'm sure that many would disagree with the views that I'm presenting. I mean, I can only tell it how I see it. But the government have tried to run me off the road. A few months back, I'd been working very intensively with a conflict artist, Piers Secunda, on his exhibition, The Holocaust on British Soil. I provided a big chunk of research for it, which was supposed to be credited. But I turned up to the exhibition and there were 50 other names credited. Mine was not on there. So I blew a storm up with him. And finally he blurted out that Lord Pickles' chief Home Office assistant, I won't mention her name, had contacted Piers and said, if you have anything to do with J-Trails, we will have nothing to do with you. Now, he wanted to get his memorial. He's been taking latex casts of the execution walls on Alderney. He wanted that to be part of the national memorial. So he wanted to do business with the IHRA. And so that was a real problem for him. But yes, so we've suspected at many points there's been this unseen hand operating, but we saw one of the most senior civil servants in the country actually telling someone that they couldn't work with a legal registered UK charity. So it's that I thought was quite shocking. Anyway, we're just flashing through more of this. Helgoland camp was described as having 600 Jews in 1944. We've just found this image of the camp. We just bought the library of Captain Panchev. Now I should mention that the first semi-official history of the camps was produced by THX Panchev, who had just retired from being C. He was number 3 in British intelligence. So would you expect secrets to be revealed in his book about the Alderney camps? Probably not. He'd signed the Official Secrets Act. The person who actually blew the lid on all of this was Solomon Steckel, an Israeli journalist in 1981 who revealed documents and evidence that the British had covered it up, and particularly allowed SS Commandant List to go and to walk free. And he also exposed a direct lie by the British government that Karl Hoffman, the island commandant, had been executed in Kiev in 1945. That was a complete fabrication, and he proved it. And what is interesting, we've got to talk later about the impact of the Eichmann trials on Britain. Now, all of this actually spun out of the Eichmann trials. So Steckel, for some reason, was in an office next to Bureau 6 of the Israeli police, who were collating the evidence in the Eichmann trial. And he says casually, they came over and showed me this information about Britain. So I'm concluding that he did actually have some official role in the Eichmann trial. And certainly he was very angry and affronted by what he saw. I also strongly suspect that Mossad might well have had some hand in all of this, because Steckel, single-handedly it seems, managed to virtually burst into a meeting single-handedly with Maggie Thatcher. So he very nearly got a personal audience with the Prime Minister over all this in 1981. He had a very remarkable effect on the British establishment. And I interpret it as a slap in the face by the Israelis, a slap in the face of the British government for hiding the Holocaust. That's my interpretation. So anyway, how are we doing for time?
5 minutes.
Yeah. So there's Helgoland camp today, and those nice little concrete gate posts at the front of a neat little holiday bungalow are the gate posts of the slave labour camp. There was also a lager Borkum. Once again, the conventional historians say, oh, it was benign. It was all volunteers, paid labourers, etc. But I found out that, in fact, many of the 1,778 Ukrainians who were killed probably died in Borkum, and 3 of the suspected war criminals were also at Borkum. So that seems to be a bit of a lie. They're the gates of the Borkum as they survive today, and you've got the island tip just at the end of the road. Of interest in regard to the North African story, once again, historians don't tend to talk about Citadella camp, but this was a temporary transit camp for the North Africans, Moroccans, Algerians, and North African Jews who were brought to Alderney. They wired off these houses in the town, and then they distributed the prisoners to various camps, both on Alderney and elsewhere on the Channel Islands. But it is very, very important, I think, to point out that Jews were suffering alongside North African Arabs, Muslims, and Muslims who were being also killed. One of them, for example, was crucified on the gates of Lager Sylt. But of course, the most notorious camp really is SS Lager Sylt. These are the gates. This is last summer I did a drone survey of various sites, and it's still a site with real presence and lots of stuff lurking beneath the undergrowth. And that's the aerial shot, and I've just outlined crudely the hut bases. So most of the prisoner huts were in hollows, whereas the SS huts on the left there were on concrete bases. And there's a tunnel. You go down some steps into the ablutions room. There's a tunnel, and then that was the commandant's chalet. But in fact, it was one of only 11 SS brothels in concentration camps in Europe. So it's an important thing. Lager Norderney was a deadly OT camp until August 1943, when the transport 641 from Drancy was brought over. I published an article about this group who were evidently well known in France. There was stuff in the French newspapers in 1945, and there were celebrity victims like Léon Cartoon, the famous jazz pianist and musician. So this was all very well known in France, but somehow it never made it across the 21 miles of the English Channel. But that was the simplest way for me to demonstrate the presence of Jews on Alderney. And that's the survivor flag, which was, in fact, designed by Henri Ouzin, who was one of the survivors of Transport 641. I found this grave plaque, just post-war grave plaque, preserved in a cardboard box in Alderney Museum. Kirschblatt was one of these Jews deported from Drancy. So we have that one physical artifact relating to the death of one of the Jews from Drancy. Theodore Valency here was one of the deportees. The thing that got me cued into that story was I recognised his moustache from another photo, and that kind of cued me into the story. I would mention that it was pure luck that the circa 850 Jews deported from Drancy didn't end up being exterminated on Alderney. They were scheduled to be killed on the 4th of May 1944 because of the Allied invasion. But the chief of the island, Schramm, decided not to give the SS permission to go ahead. They were, in fact, I'll just going to find you this. They were, in fact, going to be pushed into a chamber constructed in this tunnel. There was a stout concrete wall. And whilst the story is well known, what's put about is that it was an asphyxiation. They were going to be asphyxiated in there or possibly shot. But official French reports in 1945 state that it was actually going to be used as a gas chamber. And two of the statesmen of Jersey found Zyklon B gas canisters lurking in a storeroom nearby in the 1970s and hastily buried them. But there's a few pictures of the site. So that, by the way, is now a holiday campsite. Now, believe it or not, the British government, through one of the Tory think tanks, proposed offshoring our illegal refugees, immigrants, to Alderney. And that would have inevitably been where they would have had to put the camp. So I had to point out in the press that surely the British government were not going to repeat what had happened in World War II. It was just appalling, you know. So. And I'll just show some of the concrete work. So the French Jews carried out useless work in concrete. I've found evidence of 3 Jewish stars inscribed in the concrete. You can see just the size of that construction there. And West Battery was a particularly deadly site in the quarry. And I also got into the tunnels last time. It's just unbelievable. You know, anyone could have survived constructing these tunnels. They go for about 1.5 miles into the hillside. There are execution walls. These execution walls here were proven by American CSI ballistics experts to be definitively execution walls, and the slugs found embedded in the wall were for Mauser rifles, and every evidence of procedural execution is discovered. So you can see all the pits. So the smaller pits are basically where they've gone through people. The larger pits are where they've missed people. And we also know many other killing locations. So there was a bridge just past my shadow there where they used to throw prisoners off in groups, weighted down, and also thrown off Bibette Head. And also you see that breakwater. Before the cemetery was instituted, they used to take lorry loads of bodies down the breakwater there and dump them off the end. You can actually drive down there. My friend Michael drives me down there, which gives me consternation because when you have to turn around at the end, there's hardly any room to do it. And I should mention that Albert Eberlegon mentioned that the tunnel incident was a gassing experiment. So they had 2 rehearsals of their own death. And there was lots of evidence for abuse against Jews. And in terms of mortality rates, our current experts working with the government say 600 to 900. However, just about everybody else says that thousands probably died. Some prisoners estimated 3,000. Glees went for the 3,000 figure. He also estimated there were 16,000 prisoners passing through Alderney. Once again, the experts just don't seem to have got a handle on the fact that just because you've got a certain number of people in the camps, that's not the final number. That you've got a rotating cohort. So as people become sick or worked out or die, you replace them. So even if you have 4 camps with 1,500 in, that doesn't mean that the total number is only 4 to 6,000. That you're going to replace that about 3 times over. I also had did a lot of study of the camps in northwest France, and the Rapport Définitif number 4 stated that the official global death rate in these camps was 85%. So this is where the evidence is going, and this is why I've been insisting over a number of years that this has got to be looked at. However, the inquiry that's just been announced is good news, but just about everybody on that inquiry has already been working on this with this IHRA group who have been trying to minimise the figures. So they already know, they're already very, very committed to these numbers, and they're unlikely to put a bonfire under their own careers by saying, yeah, we've studied this for the last 5 or 6 years or 10 years. We're going to change our minds now. It seems unlikely to me. to be honest. But here we are. And also, there's only one Jew on a panel of 11 experts, which seems to me to be kind of token Jewism. You know, it's just a minimal participation of Jews. There's no independent oversight. If Yad Vashem had been chosen to head it up, you know, and we had a panel of totally fresh eyes with some, you know, real experts, then I would have been confident. But if you're asking the same people who've been doing this for several years and haven't, in my view, come up with reasonable analysis, then it's, you know, where it's kind of gonna go. So, and just very briefly, you can see there are remarkable aerial photos. This is the cemetery in 1943, and I was able to identify this area here appears in 1943, and it correlates with a statement by George Pope, who was a British subject who remained on Alderney during the war. Of course, they say there were no British witnesses. That's not true. And he said that 300 to 400 Jews died of dysentery, and they were buried in a pit on Longy. And those appear in the aerial photos at exactly that time. And I did some aerial drone photogrammetry to have a look at this. So this is from a 3D photogrammetry model, which helps you see things. So you can see all these parch marks from last year. So this is in the main cemetery area. You can see how it replicates these lines of graves here. But there is a very faint, you see a very faint shadow showing that the edge of that pit still survives. And so one of the archaeologists did a transect on the very south boundary of the pit with a GPR machine, which proved that there is a pit there. So in my view, there are 300 to 400 Jews probably potentially buried in that precise area there. I'll just basically mention about the British cover-up. It's all in the files. There's no question about it. It is historical fact. And yet some of these historians have been branding me a conspiracy theorist for simply stating what is in the file. It is an accepted historical fact. One of the experts on the group has said, in a very muted way, albeit in her book, that there was a British cover-up. And it's shocking to see. And you see this phrase, list, okay, this is the SS commandant, handed over to the Russians, so no action necessary. Complete load of baloney, because I got another document from the same date saying that he's in special custody. He's a top secret prisoner. As I say, the British categorically stated that no Jews were harmed on Alderney, okay? And yet here's a report by the French authorities about atrocities or mistreatments of Jews. And of course, we've got Steckel, who kind of blew the lid on this. But I just mentioned, just to close here, that one of the few actual top-grade secret documents in Kew is relating to Hoffman, the island commandant. So he was a special prisoner. He was a protected witness, as was, it turns out, another SS man who the Polish wanted, but they were told they couldn't have him. Anyway, that's enough for me. Thank you.
Marcus, thank you, and congratulations on your tenacity. You stuck to a very important issue. So
Yeah, I think it's when you're up against people who've got all the capacity. I mean, you're up against the government, you get up against universities with big budgets. It's very easy to run down the little guys. You know, we only get 20k a year to fund J-Trails. It's nothing. And the leave and things, we've had to come up with ways to amplify our power. So investigative journalists have been our friend because they get it. And they're the ones who've really got it into the arm. We've worked very, very closely with them. And we had a big Sunday Times article 2 years ago, which really did irritate the British government very, very considerably. And it's kept coming over and over again in the press. Der Spiegel did an influential piece, which once again, if the Germans are saying, why are you ignoring this, then the British government, you know, have a Houston, we've got a problem moment. So, anyway.
We're going to
Enough.
no, it's not enough. It's,
Yeah.
it's very important work. and I know you're gonna continue, but we have dinner. So there's food here. How should I, what are we gonna do?
It's coming, yeah.
It's still coming.
No, it's in the front desk. They're bringing it in.
Can I bring it?
Yeah.
So we still have a few minutes?
Yeah, I think we're gonna break, right?
Yeah.
Maybe? So yeah, during the break they'll take part of it.
Absolutely, let them bring it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we have a few minutes. So as soon as I bring it, we'll stop. So we can do some Q&A.
Yeah,
So I'm bringing
any
pizza
questions?
And some food, and we'll have a break, and then we're gonna show a film. So, there's a lot of questions. Joel, if you wanna come back
Yeah.
to the front, you're welcome.
Yeah,
So-
front first, yeah.
I think Naya had a question, and I cut her off.
Yes, yeah, we cut someone off earlier.
Yeah.
No, it's just so fascinating. Both, my knowledge of Holocaust is mostly on the Eastern Front, on Soviet soil. And I had no idea that the Germans had invaded and set up camps in British territory. So I just, for me, it was just fascinating. So as you were speaking, I was putting together the history of it.
Thing I thought I was knowledgeable about the Holocaust. And then I met Martin Dean, who was one of the editors for the United States Holocaust Memorial Camps and Ghettos Encyclopedia. And he simply illustrated to me that the Nazi archipelago of camps, prisons and ghettos was spread pretty evenly all over Europe and into Africa. There were 2,300 Zaufs, so 2,300 labour camps for Jews, for example. You know, there were 15,000 camps. So we've been, to some degree, led to really only consider Poland and so on and the extermination camps when the Holocaust was spread very evenly across Europe and bad stuff was happening in lots of people's backyards. And indeed, one of the French journalists said in the Pas de Calais, he said, you know, how was it that, you know, the Holocaust was happening on our own very cobbled streets and we simply didn't notice it? You know, so that's the thing you need to get clearly in your mind, that, you know, that there were, you know, 32,000 sites of Nazi oppression across Europe. You can see it in the United States, in the camps and ghettos encyclopedia.
But the interesting thing is that on Soviet soil, they shot en masse and put them in ravines. They did not create camps.
Yeah.
It seems that there was a different protocol.
Well, so you got Holocaust by bullets on Russian territory. So we don't really know how many were killed in that scenario. But of course, we've got, you know, camps, you know, spread over. Obviously, there are different classifications of camps. And of course, what's interesting about the Northern camp was it was actually essentially, in my view, a special camp because they were French political prisoners. So it didn't seem to be the object that they were going to exterminate these French Jewish prisoners because they had some degree or status under Vichy law as conjoint Arienne, etc. So there are sort of nuances. Now, you're at the front there, yeah?
Yeah, I have two quick interventions. The first one, I will wear my hat of political advisor just to answer the question why they don't want. First, you don't give bullets to the opposition with such a sensitive matter. The second, the implication, moral implications, historical implication, that there was a narrative sold to all Europeans, to all the world, that they were fighting Nazism, and suddenly they have this big cover-up. And then the implication of other countries. Now I will move to the next one, which will challenge what you said about Moroccan Jews dying in that island. I know that Morocco was a protectorate of France, and there was Lyopi, he was the manager of the council of the protectorate. He came to the king, Mohammed V, and asked him, based on Vichy law, to give him all the Jews. He gave him, he told him, he asked him first, like, that they need to wear this yellow band with the David star. He told him, if I allow you to do this to Moroccan citizens, you have to give me 6 more bands because I need to wear them. Moroccans are equal. This is written in the.
Yeah. Can I just get? I mean, just to clarify, in my view, I think when the word Moroccan was being used, it was being used loosely. I think most of the North Africans were actually Algerians. I think that's a more historically accurate.
That makes sense because at
Yeah.
that time that was
Yeah.
French Algeria.
Yeah. So basically, the reach of the French Republic sort of empire is pretty much the template for where a lot of these prisoners came from. And yeah. Anyway, someone else.
No, I think we're going to end it here. I don't want the food to get cold.
No, pizza
can
is
Snack on
good.
some Pizza, speak to Marcus and Joel.
Yeah, you can catch me any time
So
to
thank you.
talk. You can enter the rabbit hole.
So enjoy the pizza. I think in about 30 to 45 minutes we'll start the film. It's an interesting film. So it's very.